In this series, we're going to discuss the most fundamental and foundational skills in freestyle, what they look like, how swimmers need to execute them, and why they're so important. We're going to go over upper body propulsion, lower body propulsion, timing and rotation, breathing, and alignment. These are all the key skills in freestyle swimming, and if swimmers can execute them at a really high level, they're going to swim really fast. And for coaches, it's really important to be able to see these skills, because once you can see them, you can help swimmers learn to change them. Today specifically, we're going to be focused on upper body propulsion. We're going to try to keep things simple and focus on the big outcomes that we're looking to accomplish so that we don't get lost in the weeds, so that we can be really clear about what's important, why it matters, and what we need to do about it. So what we're going to cover is what needs to happen to create propulsion with the upper body. We're going to cover the strategies that swimmers typically use to do so. We'll discuss why they work, and we'll discuss how things differ depending on the task swimmers are trying to accomplish, as well as how they can differ from individual to individual. From a bottom line standpoint, what swimmers are trying to do is move as much water backwards as they can with each stroke. The more water they can move back with each stroke, the faster they will swim. And the way they can do that is they need to create a big surface area with as much of their arm as possible. They need to have that surface area moving backwards for as long as possible, and they need to pick up the hand speed in order to create the appropriate force. So that's basically what swimmers need to do. Big surface area, long period of time, accelerate the limb. And if they can accomplish that, then they're going to swim fast. So let's examine what that looks like when actually swimming. So we'll take a look at distance freestyle first, because as I alluded to, the distance that swimmers are swimming, the task they're trying to accomplish, will influence how they choose to create propulsion with the upper body. So as we'll see with this athlete, the first thing is to create a big surface area. So as you can see here, the whole forearm is facing backwards. And if it moves backwards, that means the body is going to move forwards. So he's got a great position here, and he's going to move it backwards for as long as possible. So now what the second thing I want you to pay attention to is, see this position he's in? He's going to maintain it all the way through the back of the stroke. And so we've accomplished two objectives so far. One, it's a big surface area moving backwards. We've got this position here. If he was just using the hand, you'd have kind of the dropped elbow position, which is what people refer to often. And again, all that really is you've created a much smaller surface area, and that's why it's a problem. So he's got this big surface area. It starts in front of his head. It moves straight back to his hip. So we've got a big, long distance that he's moving water backwards over. And then the last piece is, if you watch, there's an acceleration. So I'm going to go frame by frame here. The hand speed really picks up through the back of the stroke, and so you've got the acceleration too. So big surface area, long range of motion, accelerating hands. And if you watch, people think the arm pull is pretty complicated. It's not. There's not a whole lot going on. He just gets into position. He gets the surface area facing backwards and then just moves it all backwards. And that's all that really is happening. And so with each stroke, swimmers are trying to get a big surface area, and that's where the high elbow position, early vertical forearm, all that stuff, all that really is doing, all that's talking about is a big surface area. So big surface area, moving backwards, accelerating limb speed. That's all it really is. So we'll take a look with a sprint athlete, and we'll see the same principles, although what he does specifically is going to be a little bit different. So hand enters. You've already got big surface area moving backwards. It's not quite as significant as the other athlete, but it's still a big surface area. Everything's moving backwards, and especially now that he gets in this position, you can see from the hand all the way up to the shoulder, everything's moving backwards, and then it stays moving backwards. Even here, you can see forearm and hand are facing backwards. And so from route here all the way back through there, there's a big surface area facing backwards and moving water backwards so he can move forwards. Next, we'll take a look at the limb speed, and this is just frame by frame. You can see it just picks up towards the end of the stroke. There's an acceleration of the limb. It moves from slower to faster over the course of it. And you can see the hand speed picks up through the back of the stroke. So we've got the same principles in action: a big surface area, a long range of motion, and an accelerating pull. And that's ultimately what swimmers need to accomplish. And if swimmers can accomplish that, they're going to move a lot of water backwards with each stroke, and they're going to move themselves forward with each stroke. And if you've been paying attention, you've noticed that these two athletes are not using the exact same strategy. They're using the same principles, but it's different. And that's because they're swimming different events. The task that they're performing requires different strategies in order to optimize performance. So when the sprint athlete, they don't have time to wait. So they're going to start initiating the pull immediately. And that tends to result in a deeper pull. Now, because they're swimming over a shorter distance, they actually want to have a deeper pull because that allows them to get a little bit more leverage in the water. The flip side is that position uses a lot more energy. It requires a lot more force, but it can create speed. But because the distance is so short, it doesn't really matter in this case. Energy conservation is not so much of an issue. Maximizing speed is what we want. And so that's going to require a strategy that's maybe less efficient, but it's more effective. And so you tend to have a little bit deeper pulls, a little bit straighter arms, and you don't have any hesitation in the front of the stroke. In contrast with this athlete, there's a lot more patience. The pull is shallower. You can see that the elbow is much closer to the surface, and there's not as much limb speed. So that creates a really efficient stroke. There's no wasted energy. He's using a pull that requires less force, and that allows him to sustain his speed over the course of a race he's swimming, which in this case is the 1500. So he's using the same principles with slightly different strategies because he has to focus on sustainability. He has to be able to hold his speed as opposed to just create a lot of speed over a short period of time. And so what you'll see is distance swimmers tend to use more of this strategy. They'll have a shallower pull. They'll have a more patient pull. That allows them to create a lot of speed, but with a much lower energy cost. And so it's no coincidence that swimmers are selecting these strategies. It's because they're more effective for a certain event. However, the principles are the same. It's still big surface area. It's still long range of motion. It's still accelerating hand speed. Another important idea is that individual swimmers swimming the same events will still often display slightly different strategies. And that's because they have different bodies. They may have longer limbs, they may have shorter limbs, they may have more range of motion in their joints, they may have less range of motion in their joints, they may have more strength in specific muscles, they may have less strength in specific muscles. And again, while they use the same principles, you'll probably see some variation from swimmer to swimmer. And so we've seen this athlete swimming distance events. Now we'll take a look at this athlete. And so there's less pause in front, there's less gliding. However, there's still a shallow pull. The elbow stays pretty close to the surface. There's still some patience out in front, and they're still following the general principles. There's a big surface area established right here, and it's held throughout the stroke to right here, and there's an acceleration of the limb. And so you have two athletes that are equally successful. They're swimming the same event, and they're using the same principles, but they're applying them slightly differently because they have different ranges of motion. Something is different about these athletes. It's hard to know exactly what that is and why that results in certain changes. However, it's important to understand that these things happen and there will be individual differences even though they're using the same principles, and they may be using the same principles equally well. It's just different, suited for their own needs. And the same thing applies in sprint events. And so if we watch the two athletes in the screen here, we'll see that they use slightly different strategies. The athlete in the back drops the elbow a little bit more and has a little bit less patience in the front of the stroke. That's not necessarily good or bad. It's just going to be different. And so you see the same things happening in the sprint events as you do in the distance events. There's going to be slight differences and sometimes even significant differences, but they're still following the same basic principles. They're just using a slightly different strategy because it's going to be a little bit more effective for them. Upper body propulsion, at the end of the day, is not particularly complicated. Swimmers are trying to move as much water backwards as possible, and the way they do that is by creating a big surface area with the whole arm, using as much of the arm as possible. They're going to establish that surface area as early as they can, and they're going to move it back for as long as they can, and they're going to accelerate the limb throughout that whole pull. And when they can do that, they're going to maximize the amount of water they can move backwards with each stroke, which maximizes the speed that they can create in the water. Hope that was clear. Keep it simple.